When my son slammed the door and told me, "You're too old, you don't belong here anymore," I walked away carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. 3 nights later, I was sitting across from a lawyer, learning that my late husband Harold had hidden more secrets than anyone in our family ever guessed. What Michael and Jenny thought was their victory was about to turn into their downfall. Because let me tell you, sweetheart, this widow wasn't done yet. I went from being thrown into a roadside motel to holding $33 million and the keys to everything they tried to steal. And trust me, the road from betrayal to justice is filled with more twists than a mountain switchback. The morning of Harold's funeral, the world seemed too bright for sorrow. The sky was a washed-out September blue, and the air carried the faint sweetness of fallen apples. I remember thinking it should have been gray, at least raining, to match the way my heart felt. Instead, the sun pushed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's and fell across the casket like a spotlight. I sat in the front pew, my black gloves clenched in my lap, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Harold was gone. My Harold. 52 years of marriage, gone with the last labored breath. He drew one Tuesday evening while I held his hand. The pastor spoke of his generosity, his sharp business mind, his standing in the community. People nodded, dabbed their eyes, and murmured their amens. But the Harold I knew best wasn't in those words. The Harold I loved was the man who whistled while he trimmed the roses, who never met a stranger without offering his hand, who still insisted on making me tea every morning even when his own hands had begun to tremble. That man deserved more than polished words and polite sniffles. He deserved tears and laughter, stories told from the heart. But the service felt rehearsed, as though grief itself had been pressed and starched. When it was over, I found myself surrounded by a sea of hands and faces. Neighbors pressed casseroles into my arms, old friends hugged me too tightly, and men from the company shook my hand as though we were signing a contract. Then one by one they drifted away, until the parking lot was nearly empty. I lingered, unwilling to step into the next chapter of my life. That was when Michael came to stand beside me. My boy. My only son. His face was solemn, his tie knotted too tightly, but there was no softness in his eyes. Beside him stood Jenny, his wife, immaculate as ever in a sleek black dress and heels that tapped sharply on the pavement. I thought perhaps they had come to comfort me, to say, "Come home with us tonight, Mother." But the words they spoke chilled me far more than the autumn wind. "Mom," Michael began, clearing his throat, "we've been talking. Things need to change now." "Change?" I asked. My voice was thin, almost swallowed by the breeze. "What do you mean, dear?" Jenny stepped forward, her hand slipping around his arm like a claim. "You've done enough already, Alice," she said smoothly. "It's time to let Michael take responsibility. The house, the company, it all needs a steady younger hand. You don't have to worry anymore." Her words clanged in my ears. You don't have to worry anymore. As though my life, my work, my memories were nothing but a burden to be lifted from me. "This is my home," I whispered. "Harold and I built it together. And the business, we started it side by side. I kept the books myself in the early days, when there wasn't money enough to hire anyone." Michael's jaw tightened. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "You're too old to manage it now, Mom. Jenny and I can handle things. It's for the best." For the best. I had said those same words to him when he was a boy, when I made him eat his vegetables, when I insisted he wear his raincoat. Now he used them against me, as though I were a child who couldn't be trusted. I rode home in silence with them after the burial, my heart thudding like a trapped bird. The house greeted us with its familiar warmth, the smell of Harold's aftershave still lingering in the hall, the faint squeak of the stair railing he had promised to fix. But something was wrong. In the foyer, boxes were stacked neatly, labeled in thick black marker. Clothes, kitchen, miscellaneous. My things. I stared at them, not understanding. "What is this?" I asked. Jenny's smile was thin as a knife. We thought it would be easier for you if we packed a few things ahead of time. A fresh start, Alice. You'll be more comfortable somewhere smaller, more manageable. Michael shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. My own son, silent while his wife erased me from my home. I don't want a fresh start, I said, my voice breaking. I want my life. I want my home. You'll thank us later, Jenny replied. It was then I saw Michael reach into my purse, pluck out the familiar brass house key, and slide it into his pocket. He didn't even look at me as he did it. My knees buckled, and I had to grasp the edge of the table to steady myself. That night, with 2 small suitcases and my wedding album tucked under my arm, I stepped out into the rain. The porch light glowed behind me, warm and steady, but no one called me back. No one said, "Wait, Mom, don't go." Only the click of the deadbolt followed me into the night. I stood there for a long moment, the rain soaking my coat, staring at the house where I had raised my son, where Harold and I had dreamed our dreams. Then I turned and walked down the path, each step heavier than the last, carrying not just my luggage but the weight of betrayal. And just like that, I was no longer a wife, no longer a mother with a place at her own table. I was a stranger cast out of the life I had built, left with nothing but memories and the ache of being told I was too old to matter. The motel sat just off the highway, tucked behind a gas station and a diner that never closed. Its neon sign buzzed and flickered, vacancy like a tired heartbeat. I had never stayed in such a place in my life. Harold and I used to joke when we passed roadside motels on our way to the shore, saying, "Those are for travelers who've lost their way." Now here I was, suitcase in hand, one of them. The room smelled faintly of cigarettes and bleach. The carpet was threadbare, patterned with stains that told stories I didn't want to know. The bedspread was scratchy, the kind that clung to your skin with static. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my wedding album on my lap, and listened to the hum of the air conditioner. It was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard. I didn't cry that first night. My tears had already been wrung out of me. Instead, I sat there with my hands folded, staring at the blank wall, wondering how my life had turned so quickly. 1 week earlier, I was Harold's wife, keeper of our home, partner in his work. Now I was a widow in a cheap motel, cast aside by the very boy I had carried in my arms. Loneliness has a way of creeping into your bones. The silence pressed down on me until I began to talk to myself, just to hear a voice in the room. I told Harold about the weather, about the way the diner across the street smelled of frying bacon. I told him I missed him, that I didn't know how to go on. And though there was no answer, somehow speaking aloud kept me from unraveling. But amid the confusion, a small stubborn thought rooted itself in me. This cannot be the end of my story. Michael and Jenny wanted me tucked away, silent, erased. They wanted to call me too old, too feeble, too irrelevant to stand in their world. But I had lived through too much. Through lean years when Harold and I scraped by on pennies, through nights I sat up with Michael when he was fevered, through the slow, cruel decline of Harold's health. I wasn't about to give up now. The next morning, I walked across the parking lot to the diner. The waitress, a kind girl with tired eyes, poured me coffee and called me Han. That small kindness warmed me more than the bitter drink. I sat there with my notebook, scribbling down numbers, dates, names of lawyers I still trusted. If Michael and Jenny thought they could sweep me away like yesterday's dust, they had underestimated me. By the time I walked back to my room, the air smelled of gasoline from the highway, the sun was already high, and I felt something stirring in me I hadn't felt since Harold first started the business: determination. They had taken my house key, but they hadn't taken my will. And so, in that shabby motel room with its rattling air conditioner and peeling wallpaper, I made my decision. I would seek legal advice. I would find out exactly what Harold's will had said, and I would take back what was mine. I've always believed that the hardest step in any journey is the first one out the door. Sitting in that motel room with my lukewarm coffee and stale muffins from the diner, I told myself I would call a lawyer. But when it came time to pick up the phone, my hand shook. It wasn't just fear, it was shame. Shame that my own son had thrown me out. Shame that I, a woman who had once run a household and balanced the ledgers for a growing company, was now reduced to living out of 2 suitcases. But Harold had always trusted one man, Samuel Grant. He had been Harold's lawyer for more than 30 years, and though the two of them had their quarrels, Harold never once doubted Samuel's integrity. My stomach twisted as I dialed his number, afraid he might turn me away or worse, confirm Jenny's smug words, that I had no place in my own home anymore. To my surprise, his secretary put me through right away. Alice. Samuel's voice came warm and steady through the receiver, though tinged with sorrow. I've been expecting your call. Expecting my call? That made me pause. He asked me to come to his office that afternoon. I ironed my one decent blouse with the motel's tiny iron and took a bus into town. The city felt colder than usual, buildings casting long shadows that seemed to swallow me up. But when I stepped into Samuel's office, the familiar scent of leather and pipe tobacco greeted me, and for the first time in days I felt a flicker of hope. Samuel was older now, hair gone silver, glasses perched low on his nose, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He stood when I entered, clasping my hands in his. Alice, he said gently, I was sorry to hear about Harold. He was a complicated man, but he loved you dearly. I sat across from him at a polished oak table, my heart pounding. Samuel, I need to know the truth. Jenny and Michael told me I have no claim to the house, to the company. They said I'm too old to manage it, that it all belongs to them now. For a moment, Samuel just looked at me. Then he let out a sound that was half chuckle, half sigh, and reached for a thick folder on his desk. Alice, he said, that's not only cruel, it's false. He opened the folder and spread out documents in neat stacks, tapping them with his finger. According to Harold's will, which he updated only a year ago, you are the sole owner of the family home. You also hold the controlling shares in the company, 51%. Beyond that, Harold left you 65% of all other assets, which amounts to roughly $21 million. My ears rang. I thought I had misheard him. 21 million? Samuel nodded. Yes, and that's just your share. He pulled another paper forward. As for Michael, Harold left him a trust worth $12 million, but with a very specific condition. That he care for you, support you financially, and ensure your well-being for as long as you live. The moment he fails in that duty, or worse, expels you from your home, he forfeits the trust entirely. I gripped the edge of the chair, my heart racing. Then by turning me out, by treating me this way. Samuel finished the thought for me, his eyes steady on mine. Michael has effectively voided his right to the trust. By law, all of it reverts to you. Which means, Alice, that you now hold not only your share, but also the trust assets. Together, that comes to about $33 million under your control. I sat back stunned. $33 million. The figure felt unreal, like something out of a story told about other people's lives. And yet here it was, written in legal documents with Harold's signature at the bottom. For days I had felt stripped of everything. My home, my dignity, even my place in my family. Now, in one afternoon, I was told that I wasn't powerless at all. I had more strength, more authority, than my son and his wife could have imagined. I closed my eyes and pictured Harold. It was just like him to play his cards close to the chest. He had known Michael's weakness, his pride, his greed, and had crafted a will that tested it. Perhaps he had hoped Michael would rise to the occasion, that caring for me would soften his heart. Or perhaps Harold had known deep down that our son might fail, and he wanted to protect me from the cruelty that followed. I opened my eyes to Samuel's steady gaze. So what do I do now? He leaned back in his chair. First, we freeze the accounts. Then we notify the courts that Michael's forfeiture has been triggered. After that, we begin proceedings to return you to your home and secure your position as head of the company. And Alice," he lowered his voice, "we open an investigation into Michael and Jenny's conduct. Their attempt to evict you is not only a betrayal, it may very well be criminal." The room seemed to tilt around me. Part of me wanted to cry with relief. Another part wanted to scream in anger at the depth of Michael's betrayal. But above all, a quiet strength rose in me like a tide. They thought I was too old, too feeble, too easily erased. They thought wrong. When I left Samuel's office, the late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, spilling golden light across the street. I clutched my handbag close, not because of what it held, but because of what I now carried inside me. Knowledge, power, and the first spark of resolve. As I waited for the bus back to the motel, I whispered to myself, "This isn't the end, Harold. Not yet. I'll see this through. For you, for me." And for the first time since the funeral, I felt the faintest trace of peace. When I returned to the motel that evening, the place looked a little less shabby than it had before. The paint still peeled, the neon sign still buzzed, but something inside me had shifted. The walls no longer pressed in on me. I had walked into Samuel's office as a discarded widow, and I walked out as a woman holding the reins of her own life again. I laid Harold's photograph on the bedside table, the one I'd carried in my handbag since the funeral. "You old fox," I whispered. "You were protecting me even when I didn't know I needed it." His will wasn't just a legal document, it was a shield. One that Michael and Jenny had tried to strip away. But they hadn't counted on Harold's foresight. The very next morning Samuel called. "Alice, I've filed the necessary motions. The bank accounts are frozen until the court reviews everything. Michael and Jenny can't touch a penny." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Thank you, Samuel. Truly." "There's more," he continued. "We've notified the corporate board. With your controlling stake, you are recognized as the majority shareholder. Effective immediately, all decisions require your approval. Michael can't act in the company's name without you." The words washed over me like cool water. For days I had felt powerless, shoved aside by my own flesh and blood. Now, not only did I own the house, but the company itself bent to my authority. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about dignity, about being seen and respected as Harold's partner, not erased as though I were nothing. That afternoon, Samuel arranged a conference call with the bank and a federal investigator. I sat at the small desk in my motel room, the phone pressed to my ear, the hum of the air conditioner in the background. The investigator's voice was crisp. "Mrs. Whitaker, we have received credible reports of undue influence and financial coercion regarding your son and his wife. Given the circumstances, a criminal inquiry has been opened." Criminal inquiry. The words felt heavy. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. It was fraud, plain and simple. Jenny had tried to push forged documents through a notary. Samuel had hinted at that already, and Michael had stood by her side, complicit. Their greed wasn't just cruel. It was unlawful. When the call ended, I sat for a long while staring at the patterned motel curtains. My emotions swirled. Grief for Harold, anger at Michael, disbelief that my own child could betray me so deeply. But beneath it all, a steady determination anchored me. I would see this through no matter how painful. That evening I walked across the street to the diner again. The waitress, the one who called me Han, poured my coffee and asked how I was doing. I almost laughed. How could I explain that just 3 days ago I had been thrown out of my own house, and today I controlled $33 million in a company? Instead, I simply said, "Better than I was." She gave me a smile, and for a moment I remembered what kindness felt like. Back at the motel, I wrote in my notebook. Not just numbers and facts this time, but thoughts, pieces of myself I needed to put somewhere safe. They thought I was too old, Too weak. But age isn't weakness. Age is strength. It is memory. It is endurance. And I have endured too much to be pushed aside now. The next day brought more news. Samuel called again, his voice brisk. Alice, the judge has issued a temporary restraining order. Michael and Jenny cannot access the house or the company's offices until this matter is resolved. You are within your rights to return home whenever you wish. For a moment I felt the tears come, tears of relief this time. I could walk through my own front door again. The brass handle, the creak of the floorboards, the smell of Harold's books, it was still mine. But then the reality set in. Could I face it? Could I walk into that house and see the boxes Jenny had labeled? The space they had tried to erase me from? Part of me longed to march in that very night, head held high, and show them I was not defeated. But another part of me knew the battle wasn't finished yet. They were cornered now, and cornered people are dangerous. So I waited. I stayed in the motel, biding my time, letting the investigators do their work. The news trickled in slowly. Jenny had indeed attempted to pass off forged documents. Michael had been present at meetings where he pretended to hold authority he did not have. Layer by layer, their scheme unraveled under scrutiny. At night, when the loneliness threatened to swallow me, I reminded myself of Harold's voice, steady and low, the way he used to say, "Alice, we'll weather it. We always do." And now, though he was gone, I felt as though he were right beside me, guiding me through the storm. The motel clerk, a kind older man with a limp, noticed me writing one evening and asked, "You here long, ma'am?" I smiled faintly. "Not too long. Just until I take back what's mine." He nodded, as though he understood more than he let on. Each day that passed I grew stronger. The fear and humiliation of being thrown out of my home began to harden into something else. Resolve. My son had cast me aside. But in doing so he had lost everything Harold had entrusted him with. The company, the assets, even his inheritance, all of it was now under my care. The tables had turned. And though I hadn't yet stepped back through the doors of my house, I knew the moment was coming. The house, the business, the life Harold and I built, it was mine again. And no one, not even my own son, could take it from me. I had always believed that lies have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully they are buried. Harold used to say the same thing, often with a wry smile. Truth doesn't rot, Alice, it floats. In the weeks after Samuel and I began our work, I saw just how right he had been. The investigators wasted no time. Every day brought new reports, thick envelopes delivered to Samuel's office, and quiet phone calls late at night. I'd sit on the edge of the motel bed with the receiver pressed to my ear, listening as Samuel explained what they had uncovered. The more I heard, the more my heart ached. Not just from betrayal, but from the realization of how low my own son and his wife had sunk. Jenny had tried to pass forged documents through a notary public. That much became clear within the first week. She had walked in with papers supposedly transferring ownership of certain company assets into her name and Michael's. Her story was slick. She claimed Harold had signed them before his passing, entrusting control to his son and daughter-in-law. But the ink was wrong, the dates didn't match, and the notary, a cautious man with a good memory, smelled something off the moment she laid the documents on his desk. He had quietly reported it, and now those papers sat in an evidence file. When Samuel told me, my hands trembled. So she tried to steal it. Not just the house, everything. Yes, he said evenly. And she wasn't alone. Michael was there waiting in the car outside. Surveillance footage places him at the scene. He didn't carry the papers in, but he knew. I closed my eyes. It was one thing to imagine Jenny pulling strings, whispering poison into my son's ear. It was another to see proof that he had gone along with it willingly. The boy I had raised, the boy Harold had bounced on his shoulders, had stood by while his wife forged away my life. The federal investigators built their case quickly. They froze more accounts, traced transactions, and documented every false signature. What struck me most was how ordinary it all looked on paper. Neat rows of numbers, tidy notary seals, black ink where Harold's careful hand should have been. Betrayal is ugly in the heart, but on the page it was cold and sterile. Then came the day Samuel called with a new edge in his voice. "Alice," he said, "it's time. Warrants have been issued. Michael and Jenny are being taken into custody." I sat at the motel desk, staring at the cheap lamp with its crooked shade, trying to absorb his words. My son, my flesh and blood, was about to be arrested. And yet, mingled with the grief, there was relief. Not revenge, not triumph. Just relief that the nightmare was finally being dragged into the light. The arrest happened quietly, without drama. No sirens, no headlines at first. Just plainclothes agents who arrived at their house one morning. Jenny opened the door, still in her pressed blouse and pearl earrings, no doubt thinking she could charm her way through anything. Michael was slower to appear, groggy and pale, but the footage later showed his face when the handcuffs clicked shut. He looked stunned, like a man who had believed himself untouchable. I didn't see it firsthand. Samuel thought it best that I stay away. But I heard about it in detail, and a small part of me wished I had been there, standing on the curb, to watch the two of them face the consequences of what they had done. That evening I walked to the diner for supper. The waitress brought me a slice of cherry pie without asking. I suppose she saw something in my face. I sat there with the fork in my hand, staring out at the glowing neon sign of the gas station across the street. And for the first time since Harold's funeral, I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't recognized in weeks. Peace. Not joy, not yet, but peace, steady and quiet. The newspapers picked up the story 2 days later. Local business heir and wife charged with fraud. That was the headline in the Hartford Times. The article laid it out plainly. Forged documents, attempted misappropriation of assets, violation of trust conditions. My name appeared only once and briefly, but I knew the truth behind every line. Neighbors began calling the motel, leaving messages at the desk. Some were sympathetic, old friends offering casseroles or a place to stay. Others were curious, their voices tinged with gossip. I let the calls go unanswered. My life wasn't theirs to pick apart. At night I sat with Harold's photograph and whispered. They tried to erase me, old love, but it didn't work. You and Samuel, you made sure of that. The investigators visited me once more before the arraignment. 2 agents in dark suits came to the motel, their expressions professional but not unkind. They explained that the case against Michael and Jenny was strong. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud, serious charges, even if they were unlikely to see long prison terms. "Mrs. Whitaker," one of them said, "you've been very brave. Most people in your situation wouldn't have had the strength to push forward." I smiled faintly. Strength isn't something you wait for. It's something you decide on. They nodded, and for once I believed my own words. When I went to bed that night, I didn't feel quite as small in that motel room. The carpet was still stained, the wallpaper still peeling, but the weight of betrayal had shifted. The shame wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to Michael and Jenny. They had thought me weak, too old, easy to push aside. But instead, they were the ones sitting in a cell, their fine clothes traded for uniforms, their hands empty of everything they had tried to steal. And me? I was still standing. I had thought the worst was behind me once Michael and Jenny were led away in handcuffs. Foolish of me, really. Life has a way of reminding you that storms come in clusters. One lightning strike rarely stands alone. The investigators didn't stop their work with the forged documents. They dug deeper, into Harold's files, the company's accounts, transfers that stretched across oceans. Samuel told me in his calm, steady way that things looked unusual. But when federal agents began visiting more often, carrying folders thicker than family Bibles, I understood unusual was just another word for dangerous. One afternoon, Samuel sat across from me in the motel diner, his coffee untouched. He looked tired, more so than I'd ever seen. "Alice," he began, "there are things about Harold's business dealings we didn't know. Offshore accounts. Wire transfers to places that raise questions. Nothing in your name, nothing illegal on your part, but Ginny seems to have gotten hold of some of this information." I blinked at him, my fork paused over a piece of pie. "Ginny?" He nodded. "She's trying to use it. To blackmail you, Alice. She believes if she pressures you with what she knows, you'll back down. She doesn't realize you're already working with the authorities." For a long moment I just stared at him. My Harold, my steady, stubborn, good-hearted Harold, involved in something shady? The thought twisted my stomach. But Samuel leaned closer, his voice gentle. "It may not be what it looks like. For now, just know that Ginny is desperate. She's reaching for anything she can." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the motel walls orange, I received a call. The voice on the other end was sharp, controlled, unmistakably Jenny's. "You think you've won, Alice?" she hissed. "You haven't even scratched the surface. I know what Harold was hiding. The money trails, the offshore accounts, the names. How do you think people will look at you when they find out your precious husband was a crook?" Her words cut deep, sharper than I wanted to admit. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about that?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Simple," she said. "Withdraw the charges. Walk away from the company. Sign everything over to Michael and I'll keep quiet. Otherwise, I make sure every sordid detail hits the front page." She hung up before I could answer. I sat there in the dim motel light, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, my heart heavy. Ginny thought she could scare me into surrender. She thought an old woman couldn't bear the weight of scandal. Perhaps once she might have been right. But after being thrown out of my home, after nights spent alone in that shabby room, after every cruel word, I had nothing left to fear. The next morning I called Samuel. "Tell the agents everything," I said. "I don't care what Ginny claims to know. If Harold had shadows, I want the light on them. I won't be bullied in his name." When the federal agents came, I told them exactly what Ginny had said. They listened carefully, their pens scratching across their pads. "Mrs. Whitaker," one of them said, "would you be willing to cooperate in a controlled meeting? If Ginny attempts to blackmail you again, we'll be ready to record it." My hands shook slightly as I folded them on the table, but my voice was steady. "Yes, I'll do it." That night, I sat awake on the motel bed, staring at Harold's photograph. His eyes twinkled the way they always had, as though he were keeping some secret. "What did you do, Harold?" I whispered. "And why did you never tell me?" I thought of the years he spent traveling for business meetings, the envelopes that arrived marked confidential, the checks deposited with no clear explanation. I had trusted him, never doubted. And now, even with him gone, that trust was being tested in ways I never imagined. But one thing was clear. I would not be silenced. Not by Ginny's threats, not by whispers of offshore accounts. If Harold had lived with secrets, then perhaps the time had come for me to live with truth. The next morning, I placed his photograph back in my handbag, tucked it carefully beside my notebook. I touched the frame lightly, like pressing a hand to his. "I'll face this, Harold," I murmured. "For both of us." The storm wasn't over. Not yet. But I was no longer afraid of the thunder. The morning of the meeting, I woke before dawn in the motel. The air conditioner rattled and clanked, trying to fight off the late summer humidity. But it wasn't the heat that kept me awake. It was the knowledge of what I'd agreed to do. I had faced many hard days in my life. The day Harold shipped out for the Navy, the nights I sat up with Michael through childhood fevers, the morning I buried my husband. But nothing compared to this. sitting across a table from my own daughter-in-law, knowing she intended to blackmail me, and knowing every word would be recorded. The agents briefed me in a small, nondescript office downtown. They slid a wire across the table, thin as thread, and explained how it would capture everything Jenny said. "Stay calm," one agent instructed. "Let her speak. Don't argue or threaten. We just need her to show her hand." I nodded, my palms damp against the fabric of my skirt. "I've never done anything like this before." "You'll do fine," the other said kindly. "You've already shown more courage than most." At noon, I walked into the cafe where Jenny had agreed to meet me. It was one of those glossy places downtown, all chrome and glass, the kind she favored. The kind where the coffee cost more than my weekly grocery bill used to. I wore my best navy cardigan and pearl earrings, nothing flashy, just enough to remind her I was still a woman with dignity. Jenny was already there, sitting by the window, her phone in one manicured hand. She looked up as I approached, her lips curving into that thin smile I had come to know so well. Not warm, not kind, sharp, like a blade hidden behind lipstick. "Alice," she said, standing just enough to press a cold kiss to my cheek. "I'm glad you came." I sat opposite her, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "You said you wanted to talk." She leaned back, crossing her legs, her heel dangling from the edge of her shoe. "I'll get straight to the point. Harold's money wasn't as clean as everyone thinks. Offshore accounts, payments no one can explain. I have documents, Alice. Enough to make the feds circle like vultures. If you don't want your precious reputation dragged through the mud, you'll sign the company over to Michael. Walk away quietly, and this all stays between us." Her words dripped like poison into the quiet cafe. I could feel the wire warm against my skin, recording every syllable. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "And if I don't?" Jenny's smile widened, triumphant. "Then I make sure every paper in New England prints the truth about Harold. Do you really want your husband remembered as a fraud? Do you want your name tied to scandal in your final years? Think about it, Alice. Do you really have the strength for that fight?" Her words should have crushed me. Instead, something inside me grew still, like the quiet at the eye of a storm. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had convinced my son to betray his own mother, who had boxed up my life and tossed me into the rain. And I realized she was frightened. Desperation clung to her like perfume. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "Jenny, I've lived through worse storms than you can imagine. You can't scare me with shadows. If Harold had secrets, then let the truth be known. But I won't be bullied, not by you, not by anyone." For a flicker of a moment, her confidence cracked. Then she laughed lightly, shaking her head. "So stubborn. Fine, Alice. Don't say I didn't warn you." She stood, smoothed her dress, and left, her heels clicking like gunshots across the tile. I sat there for a moment longer, my breath trembling in my chest, before one of the agents approached, disguised as another customer. He set a receipt on my table and murmured, "We got it. Every word." Relief washed through me so fast I nearly cried. I pressed my hands together, whispering a silent thank you to Harold, to Samuel, to anyone who had given me the strength to face her. That night, back in the motel, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The wire was gone, the danger past, but the adrenaline still hummed in my veins. I thought of Jenny's smirk, her threats, her desperation. For so long I had seen myself as powerless, too old to fight. But today proved something I hadn't dared believe until now. I was stronger than they imagined. Stronger than even I had known. As the night deepened, I whispered to Harold's photograph on the table. "They think they've written the ending, old love. But they don't know me yet. I'll finish this story on my own terms." And for the first time in months, I fell asleep not as a woman cast aside, but as one who had begun to reclaim her place. A few days after the meeting with Jenny, Samuel called me to his office. His tone was different this time, measured, almost careful. "Alice," he said, "the agents want to speak with you directly. There are things you need to know about Harold." For hours afterward, my mind refused to settle. I walked circles around my motel room, smoothing the bedspread, folding and refolding my cardigan, even pacing the narrow strip of carpet until my knees ached. What more could there be? I had already learned my son had betrayed me. Jenny had tried to blackmail me. What other truths lay hidden in Harold's shadow? The agents met me in a government building downtown. Plain brick with no sign on the door. Inside, the hall smelled of paper and coffee, the air humming with fluorescent lights. They led me into a small conference room where Samuel was already waiting. He gave me a reassuring nod, but I could see the strain in his eyes. A woman in a navy suit introduced herself as Special Agent Monroe. She had a folder in her hands, thick with documents, but when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "Mrs. Whitaker, you deserve the truth about your husband's work. Some of what we're about to share has been classified for decades." I gripped the arm of my chair. "Go on," I said, though my voice quivered. Monroe opened the folder. Harold Whitaker was not just a businessman. For more than 30 years, he served as a confidential informant for the U.S. Treasury Department. He provided intelligence on international money laundering schemes, offshore operations, and organized financial crimes. Much of the wealth in his accounts was not ill-gotten gains, but payments made legally by the government for his cooperation. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The words felt heavy, unreal. My Harold, an informant? Working with the government in secret year after year? Monroe continued. Your husband was instrumental in dismantling several major networks. He lived a double life, Mrs. Whitaker, one he kept even from you for your own protection. Every offshore account Jenny threatened you with was a cover, carefully structured to conceal his role until now. I sat back, my heart thudding. All those years, I whispered. The late-night phone calls, the sudden trips. I thought it was just business. He never told me. Samuel reached across the table, laying his hand over mine. Alice, Harold loved you, but he knew the less you knew, the safer you were. He wasn't hiding shameful secrets. He was protecting you. Tears stung my eyes. I remembered the countless evenings when Harold had returned home tired, brushing off my questions with a weary smile. Just business, Alice. Nothing for you to worry about. And I had believed him, never pressing too hard. Now I realized he had been carrying a burden I couldn't even imagine. Agent Monroe leaned forward. Jenny's threats are meaningless. The government is aware of every account, every transfer. Harold's records are sealed, his work verified. He is not a criminal. On the contrary, he is regarded with honor for what he contributed. His assets are yours, legally and rightfully. Relief and sorrow mingled inside me. Harold hadn't been the man Jenny painted him to be. He had been something far greater, and yet so lonely in his duty. Why didn't he ever tell me? I asked again, though I already knew the answer. Because he trusted you to live freely, Monroe said. He wanted you untouched by the dangers he faced. I left the meeting in a daze, Samuel guiding me gently to the street. The sun was bright overhead, people bustling by as though the world hadn't just shifted under my feet. My husband had lived as two men, one I knew and one I never did. Back at the motel, I set Harold's photograph on the table and studied it long into the evening. The twinkle in his eyes, the steady curve of his smile, it was all there, as familiar as ever. But now I saw something else in that smile. A secret kept not out of betrayal but out of love. Harold, I whispered, tracing the edge of the frame with my finger. You carried this alone all those years. You fool. You should have trusted me to carry it with you. But then I thought of Jenny's sneer, Michael's silence, the way they had tried to paint Harold as a fraud. And I straightened my back. No, I would not let their lies stain his memory. I would honor him, not by pretending ignorance, but by standing in the light of truth. That night I finally slept soundly, not because the fight was over but because I understood. My Harold had not left me with shadows. He had left me with strength, and I was ready to use it. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the way so many government buildings do. I sat in the second row, my hands folded in my lap. Harold's wedding band looped onto a chain around my neck. I wasn't there to gloat. I wasn't there for spectacle. I was there because it was my right to see the truth spoken out loud, to hear my son and his wife held accountable for what they had done. Michael and Jenny entered the courtroom in plain clothes, though the deputies flanked them like shadows. Jenny still held herself with that polished poise, chin tilted as though she could bluff her way through anything. Michael, on the other hand, looked worn. His suit hung loose at the shoulders, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow. I searched his face for the boy I had once rocked to sleep, the boy who had clung to my hand on the first day of school. He was there, faintly like a ghost behind glass. But the man who sat beside his wife had chosen his path long before this day. The judge read the charges: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The words echoed off the walls, heavy and undeniable. Jenny sat stiff, eyes forward. Michael rubbed his temples, his hand trembling. When the prosecutor spoke of the forged documents, the frozen accounts, and the attempt to strip me of my home, I felt a quiet ache deep in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was mourning, not for Harold, not for my lost house, but for the son who had chosen betrayal over loyalty. Their attorney tried to paint them as misguided, overwhelmed by grief, pressured by financial strain. But the evidence was clear, the recordings damning, the forged signatures impossible to deny. When the jury returned with a verdict of guilty, there was no gasp in the room. Everyone had seen it coming, everyone but perhaps Michael himself. The sentencing came swiftly. 2 years in prison for both of them. Not decades, not a lifetime, but enough to strip away the illusion of control they had clung to. Enough to mark their names with the stain of their choices. When the judge's gavel fell, I closed my eyes and breathed. Not triumph, not joy, just release. Afterward, as the deputies led Michael and Jenny out, he glanced at me. Just once, fleeting, a flicker of something raw in his eyes. Regret? Anger? I couldn't say. But I held his gaze steady, and when he looked away, I knew my answer. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered like gulls on a shoreline. Their questions flew sharp and fast. Mrs. Whitaker, do you plan to reconcile with your son? Do you forgive them? What will you do with the estate now? I said nothing at first, just kept walking toward Samuel's waiting car. But then I stopped, turned, and let my voice carry. Family, I said, is not about blood alone. Family is the ones who stand beside you when you are most vulnerable, not the ones who turn you out into the rain. I will not reconcile with betrayal. I will honor those who honor love and truth. The cameras clicked like a hailstorm, but I didn't care. I meant every word. That night, back in the motel, I sat with Harold's photograph one last time. I told him everything, the verdict, the sentence, the look in Michael's eyes. I wish it had been different, I whispered. I wish our boy had chosen better. But I won't carry his shame. Not anymore. The phone rang then. It was Samuel. Alice, the court has restored full control of all assets to you. The company, the estate, the trust, it's all under your name now. You can go home whenever you're ready. Home. The word carried weight, but not the way it once had. The house in Connecticut was mine again, yes, but it was more than just walls and windows. It was a place I would reclaim, reshape, and fill with my own purpose. I slept soundly that night, the motel's hum no longer a cage but simply a pause, a waiting room before the next chapter of my life. Michael and Jenny had been judged. Justice was delivered. But my story wasn't ending in a courthouse. It was only beginning. The first time I walked back into the house, I paused on the porch with my hand resting on the brass handle. It was the same door Harold and I had walked through countless times, bringing Michael home from the hospital, carrying groceries, greeting neighbors with pies at Thanksgiving. For weeks I had dreaded this moment. I thought the memories would crush me. But instead, as I pushed the door open and stepped inside, I felt something unexpected. Peace. The rooms were quiet, dust lingering in the afternoon sun. The boxes Jenny had labeled were gone, the house restored to order, but the air still carried the faint echo of betrayal. I stood in the foyer, closed my eyes, and whispered, "This is mine again." Over the next weeks, I set about remaking the house into something new. The heavy drapes Harold had always liked came down, replaced with light curtains that let the morning sun spill in. The study, once filled with business ledgers, became a library, lined with the books I had long wanted to read. I painted the kitchen a soft yellow, the color of hope. Every stroke of the brush felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Neighbors began stopping by with warm smiles and cautious words. Some wanted gossip. Others truly wished me well. I welcomed kindness, but I no longer felt the need to explain myself. What mattered was not what people whispered, but how I chose to live from here on. One evening, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea and Harold's photograph on the mantel. I thought of all the women like me. Mothers, widows, grandmothers who had been silenced, pushed aside, told they were too old, too weak, too irrelevant. The thought lit something inside me. I had the means now. $33 million, not just a number but a responsibility. That was when the idea of the foundation took root. A place dedicated to protecting the elderly from financial abuse, to giving them the strength I had fought so hard to reclaim. Samuel helped me structure it, and before long the Whitaker Foundation for Dignity in Aging was born, with $15 million set aside to ensure its future. The first letter I received came from a woman in Ohio whose children had tried to take her pension. She wrote, "I thought I was alone. Now I know I'm not." I cried when I read it, not from sadness but from gratitude. My pain had been turned into purpose. As for Michael, people asked if I would visit him in prison, if I would offer forgiveness. But my answer never wavered. Forgiveness is not forgetting, and it is not an invitation back into one's heart. He had chosen his path and I had chosen mine. I would not reopen the door he had slammed shut. Instead, I surrounded myself with those who stood by me. Old friends, neighbors, the kind waitress from the motel who surprised me one day with a handwritten note of encouragement. Family, I realized, is not always blood. Family is the hands that steady you when you stumble, the voices that remind you you are not alone. One crisp autumn evening, I stood at the kitchen window watching the leaves scatter across the lawn. The house was warm with lamplight, the foundation paperwork stacked neatly on the table, my life finally my own again. I thought of Harold, his secrets, his strength, his love. And I thought of the long road I had walked since the day of his funeral. Family is not those who betray, I whispered into the quiet. Family is those who stand beside you when you are most vulnerable. And with that, I closed the curtain, turned off the light, and stepped into the new beginning I had made for myself. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.